Okay, so hopefully by now you have a Stripe account, and even if you just have a test account, like in this case, I have a test account that doesn't even have an email or password, but it will allow me to test out the Stripe API, and also more specifically the Stripe API for Python. So if I go into documentation and then full API reference, or stripe.com docs/API, I can work with curl, Ruby, Python, PHP, Java, Node. Of course, we're going to be working with Python. There is other ways to run these commands within Python, not using Stripe's library. So if you want to learn how to do that stuff, check out Coding for Entrepreneurs Core to do it without the Stripe library. But the Stripe library is pretty awesome, so we're going to go ahead and use that. So the thing that we'll want to do is check out our pip freeze. And in here, this will show us everything that's installed so far. And if I do pip install Stripe, this will allow me to actually install the package that will allow me to use the Stripe API a little bit easier and also follow their API reference, which is something that we see here. Now, the first thing that we're actually going to be working on is actually getting customer IDs associated. So like we see here, a customer object, we want to associate a customer ID with a specific user of our service. So if we look at our project, we have carts, we have our configuration folder inside of e-commerce, we have orders, templates, and products. So what we could do now is we want to create something that will hold our account information that's related to credit card. Now, this might not be the same as authentication, so user log in and log out, or we might actually build it into it. So at this point, I plan on actually doing social authentication, but we might do something simple just to show how to do something simple. So we will kind of leave that to future videos. But for now, what we're going to be doing is actually adding in a application called apps. So we'll do Python manage.py start app accounts. So accounts is going to actually handle our user accounts for credit cards, as well as like what their subscription is and stuff like that, so we can save it. And I'm going to press enter. And while that loads, I'm going to actually go over into Stripe's dashboard. And I want to get a few keys in here. So let's go ahead and click on our account. We'll go to account settings, and we're going to get our API keys. Now there's live and test ones. For now, all we're going to worry about are test ones. So let's go into our configuration folder inside of settings. And at the very bottom, I'm going to add in Stripe secret key equals to this key that we just copied, and then publishable key would be the next one. So we'll say Stripe publishable key is equal to that. Okay, and let's spell Stripe correctly. There we go. All right, so the secret key is what we're going to actually be using internally, right? So this is what we'll actually use on our server that will create some sort of token that we can use then for this publishable key, or actually I should say the publishable key, as well as Stripe's JavaScript will actually create a token, and then this secret key will connect that token to our publishable key. It'll just basically connect all these things together, where the secret key is really going to only exist in our own code, and the publishable key will be on the browser, so the server side, or excuse me, the client side. So that's something that you can allow to be published, where the secret key, you want to keep it secret, otherwise it might run into some errors or some unwanted transactions or like refunds or something like that may occur if this secret key gets out. So if you're ever worried about that getting out, you can always refresh and make a new one. Block the old key immediately if you found something that might make you believe that the old key was vulnerable or somebody took it or something like that. So that's pretty cool. So you can change your API keys really quick. All right, so now that we've talked about that, we actually want to first off go ahead and create our new customer. And we have to do a few settings first. So I'm actually going to go back into the general documentation, and we're going to go down to getting on your website. And we will scroll down here. Actually, no, we want to go to charging cards, and we'll go into Python. And notice this is how we're actually going to charge a card in general. Now, this is going to require that we do some other stuff. So if we scroll down a little bit more, we can see saving credit card details for later. This is showing us creating a customer with a card. Well, in some cases, we're not necessarily going to need the card to create a customer. Well, in our case, we don't. Because if you look in the full API, creating a new customer, we see that account balance is optional, whatever that means. You can read it more about it. Card is optional, right? So we can create a customer without a credit card or anything like that. And that's actually what we're going to be setting up in this one. So now what we'll do is we want to set our Stripe API key. So let's go ahead and copy this, right? So this even shows the secret key that we're going to be working with. So go ahead and copy that. And inside of our newly created app, we're going to go into our models. And I'm going to import Stripe. And then set Stripe API key to our API key. But in this case, I don't want to set it equal to that. I would rather set it to the one I put in settings, which was this. Granted, it's the same exact number, but we want to be a little bit smarter about it, because if we ever need to make any changes, we'll know there's one place that we need to change it, and that is on the settings file. So what I'll do here is now import settings, so we can actually use the things that are in the settings file. So import from Django.conf import settings. And now I can replace this with settings.stripe secret key. And that allows us to connect into Stripe. Okay, so we will come back to actually connecting into Stripe in just a moment. But for now, I want to actually create a new model that is going to be our Stripe ID. So I'll just call it class, and I'll say Stripe or Stripe ID. Actually, instead of Stripe ID, I'll call it User Stipe. So like the user's Stripe account, and it will be models.model, and then it's going to be the user. It's going to take a models.foreign key, and we're going to use settings.auth user model. All right, so regardless of what you may have seen before, this is actually the best way to associate the foreign key and to the user. And the main reason for this association right here is it associates it. Number one, it associates us to the actual user account. So I'll show you what that means in the admin shortly. But number two is using settings.auth user model. If we ever want a custom user model, meaning we change what Django has built in, this setting right here would allow us to do that on the fly, where we wouldn't actually have to come back and change this, right? So like if I actually imported the user model and put user here, so it actually imported up here, this would then have to be changed later, because that original Django user model would no longer exist, or it wouldn't be the actual user model that we'd be using. So you want to do that. All right, so now that we have this, we really want not a foreign key relationship. We want a one-to-one field, so one-to-one field, because each user should only have one Stripe ID. We don't want them to have multiple. We just want them to have one. Using a foreign key would allow us to have multiple. So then we'll just say Stripe_ID equals to models.char field, and we'll put a max length of 120. All right, so now that I have this, I can just define the Unicode of self, and it's going to return self.stripeid. And we'll just make sure it's a string by using the Python string function. Okay, cool. So now that we have this, we have our actual model itself. Let's actually go ahead and add it into our settings. So we'll go into settings, and inside of installed apps, we are going to add accounts, and actually use single quotes to be consistent with everything else. All right, and now we'll run a syncdb. So python manage.py syncdb. Okay, great. So it's synced. I'm going to convert them to south. So python manage.py convert to south accounts. Okay, so now I can actually make changes to the models as we've discussed before. Okay, cool. So now that I have the actual model coming in, you might be wondering, well, why do I have the stripe settings here instead of like on the orders page or something like that? Well, eventually we will probably put this on the orders page too, and in fact the checkout page in general. But what I want to do is when the user logs in, I want to send what's called a signal to actually create our account for this user's Stripe, right? I want to actually create that Stripe account because when they log in, we want to make sure that it's either created or it's not. So when they first log in, this is going to happen. We could do it at other times, so we could later change the signal. But basically what a signal does is it sends a message out saying to it sends a message out to other functions saying, hey, something happened. And in this case, we're going to be using a signal that is the user logged in. So if they log in anywhere, it will actually show or actually send this signal, and then we can run a function that would do something with that new knowledge. So what we're going to actually import is from django.contrib.auth.signals import user logged not login, but user logged in. So this is a signal that's actually going to be sent. So if we do logged in connect, and then we send it to a receiver function, and then we would set the model. So let's actually say like get or create Stripe, and then the sender would be, well, the sender is going to be the user model, so we'll actually just keep it at get or create Stripe. So I'll define a function get or create Stripe. Oops, I don't need this. And I will use a few attributes, so sender being one, and then user being another, and then I'll do args and keyword args. So all I'm going to do now is just I'll show you what it does. So I'll do print sender, and then print user, and that's it. All right, so to simulate this, I actually have to log in. So going back into our account, I'll go into the admin and make sure we got our server running. Oops. Okay, and refresh in here. So log out and then log in, and in our terminal we see that our sender is a user, and then our actual user is the user that was actually logged in, which in this case was jmitchell3. So that's great. And what if we want the user email? Simulate that again, and it shows us the user email. Okay, so what that means is we can actually do some stuff here. So let's go back to the Stripe API, and we see this stripe.customer.create, and it has the card attribute, but we don't need the card. We could put the email in here, so we can have a description as well as an email, but all I'm actually going to put is email. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this right here and go into our newly created get or create receiver function. So this is a signal. Think of like a signal and a receiver, like if walkie-talkie or something like that, or your cell phone even. So the one side will send a signal and the other side will receive that signal. So this is the same concept. So this is sending a signal when somebody logs in, and then it's receiving the signal here. So now that we have this, we are going to change we're going to get rid of these descriptions here, or these two different attributes, and just put email equals to user.email. And this is a solid function to actually create, because we definitely are logged in, right? So it's not going to be anonymous user like what we've seen before, because this is only happening after the user logs in. Another place that something like this might happen is after the user is created, or they actually click on their email saying that they are really their email, right? So when they verify their email. All right, so that's another place to do it. So now I'm just going to do customer equals to that, and I'll just print out customer. Okay, so I'm going to undo the user email, and I'm going to make sure this is a string. All right, so now that we have this, it should actually connect into our Stripe account because we have our Stripe set up here, the API key set up here, and it should send us back a response of customer so we can see what that looks like. So let's go into the admin, log out, and let's log back in again. And notice it's taking a little bit of time. It actually connected, and it actually sends back a dictionary that we can work with. So it's send back JSON dictionary, but we can work with it as it sends. And notice this ID here. This is the ID we want. Now with Stripe, the ID is what's unique. Email might not be unique, and we'll see that in just a moment when I actually show you the different customers after we associate this one to ours. So this is essentially what we'll see. Now, the reason I put this actual signal in here is so we can see the model it's going to be working with. It's actually going to be working with the user Stripe model. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into our user Stripe and go, first of all, I'll try and go to get the user Stripe model itself. So I'll go user.userStripe, Stripe ID, and this should raise an exception saying user Stripe does not exist, right? So it's going to try to get this, which that object at this point does not exist, or it does exist, and in that case, it doesn't have to do anything. So since it doesn't exist, we're going to assume that it doesn't exist. We're going to create this new customer, and then with this customer, we're going to get its ID and set it into our user Stripe. So new user Stripe equals to user Stripe.objects.create, and the user equals to user because it's this user right here, and then our Stripe ID, Stripe_ID equals to customer.id, so customer here, and that .id is coming from the dictionary that's actually sent back, right? So we have account balance of 0, cards, none, then we have created, currency, all that stuff. Really, all we really need is ID because all this other information we can grab anytime by using this ID. Now, let's take note of this ID. I'm actually going to copy it and paste it into here as a little comment so we can see what happens. And then the last exception, I'll just do accept and pass. Right, so it's either going to get the ID or it's going to say it doesn't exist. If something else happens, not sure what would, then it's just going to pass through. So every time they log in at this point, it's either going to check to see if it's there, their Stripe ID is there, or it's going to create one. Now, again, it's not necessary that they actually have to create one every time they log in. That's where a signal for if they verify their email, that might make more sense. Okay, so let's try it out. I'm going to log out of admin, log back in, hit login. It's taking some time, and if I scroll down, no errors happened, and it also didn't print anything because we don't have anything printed here. So let's add user Stripe into the admin. So from .models import user Stripe, and I'll just do admin.site.register, and we'll use user Stripe. Okay, so back into the admin, we do a little refresh, and we've got accounts on the top now and user Stripes, and we see this customer ID here. If I copy that and paste it next to that old one, we see that it's actually different, right? Similar, but different. So the one that we currently have is this one. So I'll put a few hashtags there. And if we go into Stripe, back into our dashboard that is, we can go and check out our customers. And we see multiple customers were made. Well, this is from other data, but more importantly, the last two are showing this one. So this one right here is that first one we made. It's right there. And then the most recent one is this one right here. And that is now associated to that user account. So if we delete that user account or we delete the Stripe account on theirs, their Stripe history might not be associated anymore, but their actual data will be recreated every time they log in, or if they already have it, then it won't. So let's actually log back in, log out, and log in to make sure that this right here does not change. Let's go ahead and log out, log in again, and notice it went a lot faster, and that's because it didn't actually have to connect to Stripe. Now if I click on this, it looks like it's the same, so I'm going to just copy it and paste over the other one, and yes, it is the same. All right, so that is User Stipe Account, and what we have here is we actually don't need to put this inside of our models. We can open a new file and call it signals.py, and then bring over, cut this whole thing out, put it into signals, and bring over all of that data that would be relevant to it, so the Stripe stuff, as well as these things. So copy that. So we have our settings for this right here, and then user logged in is the signal here. And then the last thing, we can actually get rid of these. The last thing, we would actually need to import the user Stripe. So it's a relative import, so we do from.models import user Stripe. There we go. So this is actually now showing the signal that's associated to that. So there's one note that I do want to make is sometimes you'll see the signals right next to the model that it's associated to. Realistically, this one is associated to a couple models, and for here we might want to actually keep it separate, because this is, although it's saving the data at the end of the day into user Stripe, it still has everything to do with when they log in. So the actual signal that's being sent is not related to user Stripe. So if it was kind of related to the same model, then maybe you'd put it underneath it. But in our case, we want to keep them separate, just so it's easier for us to diagnose later. And then on a more general best practices level, having it in a Python file called signals makes a lot of sense, right? Because it's actually a signal and a receiver here. You wouldn't call it receiver, but you'd call it signals, because then we're working with that signal itself. And you could make custom signals and stuff like that too, and put it in here. But again, you could put this in models or here. All right, so that is a lot of information. We just created the Stripe ID into our customer account, and now from here, we have our Stripe ID right here. So with any request that we do, we can actually use that Stripe ID. So like in our checkout, when we actually go to checkout, oops, that's not the right one. When we actually go to checkout, we can use that Stripe ID and start like collecting the credit card and stuff like that in here. So now that we have that ID, it really helps connect everything together to actually run the credit cards. All right, so we will start doing that in the next few videos, as well as kind of shaping up user login and log out. All right, see you in the next one.